My name is David Lewis. I'm a research mycologist. I live in Newton, Texas, and I've been studying mushrooms for about 50 years. Um, I got interested in plants back when I was probably a teenager because I lived in the country near Beaumont, and I started looking at plants and collecting leaves and learning the trees. So I learned some of my botany fairly early in my life, and I went to Lamar University and majored in chemistry. I changed over to environmental science, and later on I did graduate work in chemistry, but decided to go into mycology because I was interested in the chemical metabolites that are found in fungi. And I've been living in Newton on 60 acres of pristine forest for the last 25 years. Some years ago, my late wife, Patricia, was interested in plants, and she became aware of your organization, Useful Wild Plants, and started made several donations over the years to sponsor species. So over the years, we've kept we all the 4 volumes, and they're quite useful because it's just full of all kinds of information. And it's anyways, I still support the organization and think their work's great. Yeah, one of the problems we have is many politicians are not aware of the problem. I mean, well, some are aware, but they're not paying attention because we have all these serious environmental problems. And the question is, how do we get politicians to pay attention? And usually it starts with small groups of people that are really active in a group like the Big Thicket Association in East Texas. So the Big Thicket was uh, established as a preserve in 1974, but to get it established was a long road because there was a lot of opposition from the local folks. But there was a really strong core of people in East Texas: uh, Geraldine Watson, Maxine Johnson, Ned Fritz, Pete Gunner, and so on. These folks were, Ralph Yarborough was involved in this. So we had some interest back in the 60s and 70s about doing this. So these organizations, they finally got organized and put enough power behind these groups to get the attention of the politicians. Uh, this eventually led to like I said, the establishment of the Big Thicket National Preserve in 1974, which is one of the more biodiverse areas in the United States. So, yeah, you get a small group of people that are quite knowledgeable and they have their facts together, they can get a lot done. And the thing is to get the attention of the people that are in charge, the politicians or our legislature and our congressmen, and give them a call. I mean, I've called my congressman before to gripe about something. Yeah, I forgot about Ralph. You know, he was a senator and he got a lot done. Padre Island and see what else? Oh, Guadalupe Mountains too, I think. Yeah. Oh, another thing too about there in East Texas, one of ironically, one of the timber barons, Mr. Arthur Temple, was instrumental also, believe it or not, in getting the preserve established because uh, he told people, look, this preserve is going to become whether you like it or not. And he got behind, setting aside some of the Temple Inland land for preservation and getting behind the bill to establish the preserve. So there was, interesting enough, with some support from the local business folks about this. And over time, you think about it, we have a national park, it brings tourists in, and so it helps the economy. So it really diversified the economy of East Texas. So nature can, if you want to put in dollars and cents, nature does pay. You just, you have to think about it in a different sort of way. It's not just money. As a mycologist, I've been privileged to work with some specialists over the years from not only the United States but also Europe. I have colleagues in both the United States and Europe. And one of my colleagues are the Bissettes, Alan and Arlene, who I've known, gosh, since 1982. So anyway, Alan approached me about 7, 8 years ago about doing this book, and because I had the expertise on the Gulf Coast, and I said, well, let me think about it. So I asked Patricia about it. I said, this would be probably a 5-year project. She said, okay. I said, okay. I asked. So anyway, we worked on this thing for like 5 years, and finally, it was published through University of Texas Press, I think in 2019, and it's fairly comprehensive, but you can never have a comprehensive book of mushrooms because we keep discovering new species. But also the taxonomy is still in a state of flux. So, so you might learn a name and a couple years later they change it to a genus or whatever. So that's, of course, it's a problem in botany too. Yeah. But like I say, over the years, I've met colleagues from different countries. I have a colleague in Paris with the National Museum. He and I published papers on new chanterelles, new russulas. I have another colleague in London who works on a certain genus, Hebulamas, and he has all my collections. There's 13 species in Texas, and 4 will be new species to science. So you never know what you're going to find until you start talking to other experts and comparing notes. And in science, you have to collaborate because there's just so much material out there, and everybody has a different perspective about how to look at it. In fact, my colleague in England, Henry Becker, is a world expert on the genus Hebulama. He's a mathematician. He comes through it from a different way. And I have another colleague up in New Jersey, Rod Tullis, who works on amanitas. And Rod's also an engineer and mathematician. So his approach is also a little bit different than most taxonomists. So it's a different ways to look at things. Yeah, I guess one thing about, since I'm a professional, I was a chemist, but I had the interest in mycology, plants way back when I was a teenager. And as I say, one thing leads to another. And I guess the main thing is just stay curious about stay curious about the world, because you never know what's out there. And you get into botany, plants, insects, gee whiz, there's probably an untold number of new species of insects around too. And the amount of biodiversity is pretty staggering when you start looking at it. Well, there's different areas like the Smokies. We're talking about the richness of the fungal flora of the North America in general, because like the Europeans have been doing it for over 200 years, and of course mycology in mycology in North America started probably about 1820s when a gentleman named Lewis David von Swinitz came over and he started studying the mushrooms in South Carolina, and consequently, other mycology, there's a guy named Peck in New York that studied the fungi in New York. So you have these regional areas that are really studied heavily. But the Gulf Coast in general, except for a few people like Harry Tiers, who was here back in the 50s, and a gentleman named Merrill in Florida, and from 1935 to about 1955, studied the fungal flora around Gainesville, Florida. And these two gentlemen sort of started the baseline. In general, the Gulf Coast has sort of I'd say a strongly endemic flora, because it's this region from Texas to Florida, which is very similar ecologically. And a lot of these species are found only along the Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas, and a number of them. We're still going through the process of identifying certain groups, but there seems to be this trend where a lot of these things are Gulf Coast. They may extend north, maybe 100 miles off the coast, maybe a little further. We're still, trouble with mycology, there's so few mycologists to document. I'm the only person in Texas that's doing taxonomy of mushrooms, so that's one of the problems. There's just not enough mycologists for the diversity. And I would say that probably the Gulf Coast in general has pretty high diversity compared to, say, the Smokies and the Pacific Northwest, because these are two other I shouldn't say hot spots. They've been studied a lot more thoroughly. Well, I went to the Linnaean Society. I didn't see the specimens. I saw the library, which was pretty. I guess the specimens are stored somewhere else. I'm not sure, but that was quite that and the British Museum and the Kew a lot. And then I went to Paris to visit my friend who's an expert on chanterelles and russulas, and he's been to Texas at least about eight times over the years, and we, between the two of us, we've published about a dozen new species just basically from East Texas over a period of 15 years. Oh, which brings up another point. Besides myself and some other people, there's a lady that studied the Ascomycetes of the Big Thicket, Larissa Vasileva, who was a Russian scientist. She made 3 trips to the Big Thicket. She described 12 new species from East Texas of Ascomycetes. And from this and my studies and other studies, basically in the last, since 1990, we've published 40 new species of fungi from East Texas. So this gives you an indication of how much is out there. Yeah, I have five holotypes for my property, and probably another one pretty soon, I hope. And then we have the new Cartinaris were named for Geraldine Watson from her place on Lake Heights. Yes, if you discover something, you can name it. One of the things I've noticed that people, they're sort of lost the awareness of the natural world over the years because most people live in cities now, and not too many people in the country, and even people who live in the countries are sometimes not aware of what they have. And when I was back in college, I actually took courses in botany and mycology at Lamar University and Texas A&M. But now, you're hard pressed to find courses in either botany or mycology in any major university, which is kind of shocking, because these are some of the most important organisms that we have to rely on to survive on the planet. And so consequently, most of my work, I'm consider myself an amateur mycologist, but I do professional work with other scientists. And my purpose is to document the fungal flora of East Texas and the Gulf Coast, because it's a really rich area. And through publications and writing a book, it's to get this information out to the general public. Yeah, years ago, I joined a mushroom society where we had the Texas Mycological Society based in Houston, which started for us in 1977. And we had annual meetings. We mostly had our field trips into the Big Thicket, and we'd go there and collect mushrooms and to bring them back to the university in Houston, and we'd have specialists come in from parts of the country to identify the mushrooms. So this got sort of got the ball rolling about the mushroom flora of East Texas. Later on, the New Orleans Mycological Society was organized in New Orleans, and so I started working with them over in southern Mississippi and Louisiana. And eventually I became the president of the society, which I was president for like 22 years. And my late wife, Patricia, was the secretary-treasurer. So between her and me, we organized forays and mushroom walks in East Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi. And this led to us bringing more people in from different parts of the country or other countries to give talks about the mushrooms and about some of the issues dealing with how to identify them and things like this, and which led to a better understanding of mycology on the Gulf Coast in Texas. Yeah, one of the things I've found dealing with the people in general, the general public, there's a lack of scientific and just knowledge about plants and fungi in general, because people go about their life and they don't really have time to look into things or understand them. But as more people become interested, we seek to enlighten people about their roles in nature. Like without plants, we wouldn't have food. And of course, the mushrooms, the fungi are important because they recycle the dead organic matter. Some are symbiotic with other trees and plants, and then some are pathogens. So these things have great effects on us over the year, throughout human history. And not to understand this is sort of detrimental to the planet, because we're doing things to the planet by destroying plants and these habitats, and we're losing all this biodiversity. And without this biodiversity, we can have some serious problems down the road, as we're starting to see right now. Question is about how much is there left out there? Well, in mycology, I know plants are probably better known than mushrooms, although they're still discovering new species of plants. But mycology is sort of an emerging super science because we're becoming more aware of the biodiversity of fungi throughout the world. Just as an example, on my property in East Texas, I have 60 acres, and I've had specialists come there, and we've published 5 new species from my property. That's just on a small piece of land. And you start to think about all these other habitats we don't even look at. And so the potential for new species or undescribed species is pretty great. And just as an example, I had a colleague from Duke University come by to sample the soil samples under pines for fungi. He does a thing called blast DNA, where he actually, wherever they do, they look at the DNA constituents of the soil. Well, he comes back with the results. He says, potentially on my property, based on the DNA of the fungi, I have potentially 2,500 species of fungi on my property, which is like pretty astounding. Trouble is, with fungi, you have to have a fruiting body to identify and document what it is. And without the fruiting body, we can only surmise what it could be. So to get an idea about the biodiversity, we need to publish new species and document that so we know what we have out there. Yeah, one of the things I've found dealing with the people in general, the general public, there's a lack of scientific and just knowledge about plants and fungi in general, because people go about their life and they don't really have time to look into things or understand them. But as more people become interested, we seek to enlighten people about their roles in nature. Like without plants, we wouldn't have food. And of course, the mushrooms, the fungi are important because they recycle the dead organic matter. Some are symbiotic with other trees and plants, and then some are pathogens. So these things have great effects on us over the year, throughout human history. And not to understand this is sort of detrimental to the planet, because we're doing things to the planet by destroying plants and these habitats, and we're losing all this biodiversity. And without this biodiversity, we can have some serious problems down the road, as we're starting to see right now. When you talk about mushrooms, I mean, basically most of the mushroom is the mycelium, which is in the soil or in wood or some substrate. It's not very apparent. But once they decide, the mushroom, it doesn't decide, it fruits. The fruiting body is actually the fruit of the organism. That's where the spores are produced and shot off or discharged in some manner, and that way they can colonize other areas in the forest, or dead logs or dead leaves. So this thing about the decomposers are really important in keeping things moving. Well, let me say a little bit about my education at Lamar University. I went to Lamar from 1965 to 1972 for my undergraduate in environmental chemistry, and then I started graduate work in organic chemistry and became interested in these strange compounds some of these mushrooms had, which led me to go over to the biology department and find out some way to identify the mushrooms. Well, nobody knows what they are, so why don't you work on a degree over here? Because I had the minimum hours of biology to start a degree over there. So my thesis was on the mushrooms of the Big Thicket area, which was a 4-year study, and I got my master's in '78 from Lamar. Doing this, my undergraduate and graduate school, I was lucky to meet some really interesting people and influential people in the Big Thicket, including Geraldine Watson, Maxine Johnson, and other people, Pete Gutter, and so on. And they got me involved in doing mushroom walks in the Big Thicket. So I started doing that back in the 70s and 80s. And while I was at Lamar, I had a course in limnology and ecology, where our field trips were taking us to the Big Thicket. So this gave me a great introduction to the Big Thicket area. And I sort of suspected just from the plant diversity, the fungal diversity should be pretty good, pretty great also. So, but anyway, back in that period, we actually had courses in botany, and mycology, and more of the natural sciences, which apparently is not so much so nowadays. So this is making people a little bit less knowledgeable about what's going on out there in the real world. Professionally, I worked as a chemist. I was a chemist in a paper mill in East Texas for 20 years, and part of my job was monitoring the processes in the plant because we had a lot of internal processes to make paper. And as complex as these processes were, which were, they were fairly complex, but if you go into a natural ecosystem, the complexity is a order of magnitude greater because you have all these interactions between plants, fungi, bacteria, insects, and so on. All these things are interconnected through the soil mainly. I mean, the soil ecosystem is still, in a way, probably one of the great unknowns because we have an idea of things are going on, but trying to put a quantifiable number on that is kind of difficult because some of these things are very hard to study, especially since some of the fungi cannot produce fruiting bodies. So we might get the DNA says, well, there's something in the soil, but we don't know what it is because it has no name because we don't have a fruiting body to say what it is. Yeah, one of the things I've noticed over the years when I'm interacting with the general public, I do mushroom walks and all this. So usually people that are interested in this will come in and we'll start trying to educate them about what mushrooms are doing. And of course, most people are interested in, is it edible? That's this first question, is it edible? Well, yeah, every mushroom's edible one time, but you just don't eat wild mushrooms without knowing what the heck they are because some of them can be deadly poisonous. And I'm finding out a lot of the master naturalists, the master gardeners, these ladies clubs that study plants or have things dealing with plants, they have the eagerness to learn more. It's just we have to take the time to sit down with them and go through some of the things how you do it scientifically because without the scientific documentation, it's hearsay or it's a rumor until you have the documentation to say this is this and this is why it does and things like that. Because education is the key to learning about plants and fungi. One of the things a lot of people out there have no idea what plants are or what they do. Same thing with fungi. And trying to reach them is, well, I'm not quite sure if there's an easy answer to that because people have to have the interest and to get a person interested, that's the key. And I guess the best thing to do about that is, trying to encourage people to come to these meetings about natural history and learn more about nature. And how do you reach them? Well, I don't know. That's a good. I'm not sure how to reach them. Just it's about motivation. How do you get people motivated? It's like you see students they get motivated, and some of them are quite curious, and you just have to sort of take those people and mentor them and become their mentors because if they got the interest, you want to keep it going because usually by the time you become an adult, unfortunately, most adults lose their curiosity about life or things in general. And like I say, motivation is a key. And I wish I had the secret to that.